In the winter of 1874, the wealthy Vance family of St. Louis did something unforgivable. To settle a gambling debt and play a cruel joke on a solitary mountain man living deep in the Montana Territory, they didn't send him the beautiful, porcelain-skinned bride he was promised in the photograph. Instead, they put their eldest daughter, Elspeth, a woman they mocked for her height, her scars, and her silence, on a one-way train to the wilderness. They laughed as the train pulled away, convinced they were sending a monster to a beast. They thought it was a punishment. They had no idea they were accidentally writing the greatest love story the frontier would ever see, and sealing their own doom in the process. This is the story of the reject who became a queen. The drawing room of the Vance estate smelled of stale cigar smoke and expensive sherry, a scent that Elspeth Vance had learned to associate with bad news. At 26 years old, Elspeth was considered a spinster, a burden, and, in the hushed whispers of the St. Louis elite, an eyesore. She stood near the heavy velvet drapes, trying to make herself smaller, though it was impossible. Elspeth was nearly 6 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of her silk gowns. Her face was not the soft, round ideal of the Victorian era. It was angular, with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass and a thin, pale scar running from her left ear to her chin, the result of a childhood horse-riding accident that her father, Archibald Vance, never let her forget. "She takes up too much room, Archibald." Her mother, Beatrice, sighed from the chaise lounge, not even looking at her daughter. "And she eats like a field hand." Archibald Vance, a man whose fortune was dwindling as fast as his hairline, swirled the amber liquid in his glass. He looked at Elspeth with a mixture of disdain and calculation. "I've found a solution," he announced, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "A permanent one." Elspeth didn't flinch. She had stopped flinching years ago. "A letter arrived 3 weeks ago," Archibald continued, walking over to the fireplace mantel. "From the Montana Territory. Some trapper named Elias Thorne. Rumor has it he sits on a few hundred acres of timberland near the Bitterroot Range. He wrote to a marriage broker looking for a wife. The broker declined the commission, said the man was too wild, too far from civilization." "And?" Beatrice asked, bored. "And I intercepted the request," Archibald chuckled. "He asked for a woman of strong constitution. But naturally, a man like that wants a prize. So, I sent him a letter back. I told him I had a daughter available. I sent him a photograph." Archibald picked up a framed tintype from the table. It was a picture of Lavinia, Elspeth's younger sister. Lavinia was 18, petite, blonde, and undeniably beautiful. "You sent him Lavinia's picture?" Elspeth spoke for the first time. Her voice was low, a contralto that lacked the breathless squeak fashionable ladies affected. "I did," Archibald said. "I told him she was coming." He replied with a bank draft to cover the train fare and a promise of a dowry payment upon arrival. He thinks he's getting a delicate flower to decorate his cabin. Archibald laughed, a dry, rattling sound. Imagine the look on that savage's face when you step off the stagecoach instead. Elspeth felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. "You are sending me to a stranger? A man you've lied to? He will be furious. He could kill me." "Then he kills you," Archibald said with a shrug, as if discussing the weather. "And we are one mouth fewer to feed. Or he sends you back, and we are no worse off. But the train ticket is one way, Elspeth. I've already packed your trunk. You leave in the morning." Lavinia entered the room then, a swirl of pink lace. She giggled when she heard the plan. "Oh, Ellie," she tittered, covering her mouth. "Do write us if he doesn't feed you to the wolves. It's practically a mercy. You always did look like you belonged in a barn rather than a ballroom." That night, Elspeth didn't sleep. She packed her own trunk, removing the frilly, useless dresses her mother had thrown in. Instead, she packed the few things that mattered: her heavy wool cloak, her sturdy leather boots that she usually hid under her skirts, and a small pearl-handled knife she had stolen from her brother's collection years ago. She looked in the mirror. The scar stood out white against her flushed skin. She wasn't beautiful. She knew that. But as she stared at her own dark eyes, she saw something her family never bothered to look for. She saw iron. "Let them send me away," she thought. "Any hell is better than this house." The next morning, at the train station, there were no tearful goodbyes. Archibald handed her a ticket and a sealed envelope addressed to Elias Thorne. "Give him this when you get there. It explains that there was a mix-up with the photographs," Archibald sneered. "Tell him no refunds." As the steam engine hissed and the wheels began to turn, Elspeth didn't look back at the St. Louis skyline. She looked west, toward the unknown, toward a man named Elias, who was expecting a beauty and was about to receive a beast. The journey took weeks and stripped away every layer of civilization Elspeth had ever known. The train took her as far as Utah, and from there it was a series of rattling stagecoaches that smelled of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and fear. As they crossed into the Idaho Territory and then up toward Montana, the landscape changed. The flat plains rose into jagged, teeth-like peaks. The air grew thinner and colder, biting at Elspeth's skin. Her fellow passengers dwindled until she was the only woman left, surrounded by rough prospectors and silent trappers who eyed her size with wariness rather than lust. They whispered about Elias Thorne. "Thorne?" One driver spat when he saw the destination on her ticket. "You heading to Dead Man's Gulch? That's Thorne's territory. They say he killed a grizzly bear with a hatchet. They say half his face is missing. Why's a fancy lady going there?" "I'm his wife," Elspeth said, her voice steady. The driver laughed so hard he nearly dropped the reins. "His wife?" "Lady, Elias Thorne don't need a wife. He needs a keeper. Good luck to you." The final leg of the journey was a mule cart ride from the mining town of Bannock. The driver dropped her off at a fork in the road, where a crude wooden sign was nailed to a pine tree. It simply read, "Thorne." "I ain't going further," the driver grunted, dumping her heavy trunk into the snow. "He'll hear the mule. If he wants you, he'll come get you." The cart rattled away, leaving Elspeth alone in the silence of the mountains. It was a silence so profound it felt heavy. The trees were ancient, towering pines that blocked out the fading afternoon sun. Snow covered the ground in a thick, white blanket. She stood there for an hour, shivering in her wool coat. The cold was seeping into her bones. Doubt began to creep in. "He isn't coming," she thought. "He's seen me from the woods, realized I'm not the girl in the picture, and he's leaving me to freeze." She sat on her trunk, clutching the envelope her father had given her. She decided then that she wouldn't plead. If this man came to kill her or turn her away, she would stand tall. She would not give Archibald the satisfaction of her dying on her knees. Then she heard it. Not a sound, but a vibration in the ground. A rhythmic thumping. A horse emerged from the tree line. It was a massive black beast, a draft horse mixed with something wild. and on its back sat a mountain. Elias Thorne was larger than any man Elspeth had ever seen. He wore a coat made of bear fur, the fur so dark it merged with his long black beard. A rifle was slung across his back. He pulled the horse to a stop 10 feet away and stared down at her. He didn't speak. He just looked. Elspeth stood up, drawing herself to her full 6-foot height. She looked him in the eye. His face was weathered, tanned like old leather. A jagged scar ran through his left eyebrow, but it wasn't the ruin the driver had described. It was just a face that had seen war and winter. His eyes were the color of slate, hard, unreadable, and intelligent. He looked at her, then he looked around the clearing, expecting someone else. He looked back at her. "You're the Vance girl?" His voice was a low rumble, like thunder rolling in a canyon. "I am Elspeth Vance," she said clearly. Elias frowned. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled photograph Archibald had sent. He looked at the picture of petite, blonde Lavinia. Then he looked at the tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired woman standing in the snow. The silence stretched, agonizing and sharp. Elspeth braced herself for the anger. She braced herself for the insults she had heard all her life. Ugly, gargantuan, mannish. Elias crumpled the photograph in his massive fist and dropped it into the snow. He swung his leg over the horse and dropped to the ground with a heavy thud. He walked toward her, looming over her. For the first time in her life, Elspeth had to look up at a man. He circled her, walking slowly, his boots crunching on the ice. He looked at her broad shoulders. He looked at her large, gloveless hands, red from the cold. He looked at the scar on her jaw. He stopped in front of her. "You ain't the girl in the picture." "No," Elspeth said, her chin high. "That is my sister, my father. He deceived you. He sent me instead." She held out the envelope. "This explains it. I suspect he mocks us both in it." Elias didn't take the letter. He ignored it completely. He was studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. He wasn't looking at her with disgust. He was looking at her with assessment. Like a man buying a horse? No. It was more respectful than that. Like a man choosing a rifle. "You walk from the ridge?" he asked, nodding toward the tracks. "No, the cart dropped me. But you stood for an hour. Didn't sit? Didn't cry?" "Freezing is preferred to crying," she said. Elias let out a grunt. It might have been a laugh. He stepped closer, invading her space. "You're big," he said bluntly. "I am," she replied coldly. "If you wish to send me back, do it now, before the snow gets deeper." Elias looked down at her hands again. "Can you swing an axe, Elspeth Vance?" The question threw her. "I have never had occasion to." "Can you learn?" "I can do anything I have to do to survive." Elias nodded slowly. He bent down, and with a groan of exertion that seemed effortless, he lifted her heavy trunk onto one shoulder, as if it were filled with feathers. "Horse won't carry double with the trunk," he said. "It's a 3-mile hike up the switchback to the cabin, uphill, deep snow." He turned to walk away, then stopped and looked back at her. "Well?" he growled. "You comin', wife? Or are you going to stand there and freeze?" Elspeth stood stunned for a heartbeat. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't demanded his money back. He had called her wife. She hiked up her skirts, revealing her heavy boots, and stepped into his tracks. "I'm coming," she said. As they began the climb, Elspeth Vance realized 2 things. First, her father's joke had failed because Elias Thorne didn't seem to care about prettiness. And second, For the first time in her life, being big and strong wasn't a flaw. It was the only thing that was going to get her up that mountain. Smoke rose from the chimney of the cabin, a gray ribbon against the blinding white of the peaks. But it offered little comfort to Elspeth as she crested the final ridge. Her lungs were burning. Every breath felt like inhaling crushed glass. Her corset, a remnant of her life in St. Louis, dug into her ribs like a vice, but she refused to ask Elias to stop. The cabin was not the crude shack she had envisioned. It was a fortress. Built from massive ponderosa pines, the logs were thicker than a man's waist, notched together with expert precision. It sat on a plateau that overlooked the valley, backed against a sheer granite cliff face that protected it from the northern winds. There was a barn, a smokehouse, and a woodpile that looked like a defensive wall. Elias reached the heavy oak door and kicked the snow off his boots. He didn't hold the door open for her like a gentleman in a parlor. He pushed it open and walked in, dropping her trunk in the center of the room. He expected her to follow, and she did. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and curing meat. The main room was vast, dominated by a stone fireplace large enough to roast a whole deer. What surprised Elspeth, however, were the shelves. One entire wall was lined with books, not penny dreadfuls or almanacs, but leather-bound volumes with gold lettering. She squinted in the dim light. Principles of geology, the works of Plato, advanced engineering dynamics. There was a desk in the corner, cluttered with maps and drafting tools, oddly out of place for a mountain man who allegedly killed bears with a hatchet. Elias stripped off his bear fur coat, revealing a thick flannel shirt and suspenders. He was even broader without the coat. He moved to the stove, checking a cast-iron pot. "Stew," he grunted. "Bowls are on the shelf. Eat." Elspeth removed her cloak, her fingers stiff. She found the bowls and served them both. They sat at a rough-hewn table. The silence was thick, but for the first time, it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of assessment. Elias ate with efficiency, not savagery. He watched her hands as she broke a piece of hardtack. "You didn't complain on the hike," he observed. "Would it have shortened the path?" she asked. "No." "Then it would have been a waste of breath." A flicker of something passed through Elias's slate-gray eyes. Amusement? Approval? He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "The letter," he said. "The one your father sent?" Elspeth stiffened. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled envelope. "It explains—" "I don't care what Archibald Vance explains," Elias interrupted. He took the envelope from her hand. He didn't open it. He didn't look at the seal. He stood up, walked to the fireplace, and tossed the unopened letter into the roaring flames. Elspeth gasped. "You didn't read it. He might have written lies about me, to justify the switch." "I don't judge a person by paper, Elspeth," Elias said, turning to face her. The firelight cast long shadows across his scarred face. "And I don't care about your sister. I needed a partner, not a doll. A doll would have died halfway up that trail. You're here. That's all that matters." He gestured to a door on the far side of the room. "That's the bedroom. You take it. I sleep out here by the fire." "But we are married," Elspeth said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "By proxy, in the eyes of the law." "We are strangers," Elias corrected her. His voice dropped, becoming softer. "And you looked at me outside like you expected me to strike you. I don't touch what isn't offered, and I don't strike women. You sleep there. You lock the door, if it makes you feel safe. We'll see if you last the winter. If you do, we'll talk about marriage." Elspeth retreated to the bedroom. It was sparse. A bed with a quilt made of heavy wool, a wash basin, and a window looking out at the moonlit forest. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling, not from cold, but from the adrenaline crash. She had expected a brute. She had found a man who burned insults without reading them and gave up his bed. The next morning, the test began. Elspeth woke before dawn to the sound of chopping. She dressed quickly in her simplest wool dress, tied her hair back severely, and went outside. Elias was by the woodpile. He was splitting logs with a rhythmic, terrifying power. Thwack, crack. He didn't pause when he saw her. "Water barrel's empty," he said, nodding toward a frozen creek 100 yards down the slope. "Buckets are by the door." Elspeth didn't argue. She grabbed the 2 heavy wooden buckets. The path to the creek was icy. The first trip down was easy. The trip back, with 40 pounds of water sloshing against her legs, was agony. Her boots slipped. The water froze on her hands. By the time she reached the cabin, her shoulders were screaming. She poured the water into the reservoir. She went back for more. 4 trips. When she finished, panting, sweat cooling on her neck, Elias was leaning on his axe handle, watching her. "Breakfast needs making," he said, "flour and lard in the pantry." And so the routine was set. For 2 weeks, Elspeth Vance became a frontier woman. She scrubbed the rough floorboards until her knuckles bled. She learned to skin the rabbits Elias brought home, her stomach churning at the smell of blood until she forced herself to ignore it. She learned that wet wood smokes and dry wood sings. But the real turning point came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after her arrival. Elias was mending a harness in the main room. Elspeth was trying to lift a massive cast iron kettle off the hook above the fire. It was heavy, full of boiling water for laundry. "Leave it," Elias said without looking up. "I'll get it when I'm done." "I can do it," Elspeth grunted. She wrapped a rag around the handle and braced her feet. She used her height, her leverage, and the natural strength in her broad shoulders that her mother had always detested. She lifted the 50-pound kettle, swung it clear of the fire, and set it on the table with a solid clunk. Elias stopped sewing. He looked at the kettle. Then he looked at her arms, where the sleeves were rolled up. There was no disgust in his eyes. There was a flash of heat that made Elspeth flush. "Lavinia couldn't have done that," he said quietly. "Lavinia would have fainted from the soot," Elspeth replied, wiping her forehead. "Your father," Elias said, standing up and walking toward her. "He called you the ugly one?" Elspeth looked down. "He said I was built like a draft horse." Elias reached out. For the first time, he touched her. His callous thumb grazed the scar on her jawline. He didn't pull away. "Draft horses build empires, Elspeth," he murmured. "Thoroughbreds just break their legs. You aren't ugly. You're substantial. Like this mountain." He pulled his hand away quickly, as if burned, and grabbed his coat. "I'm checking the traps on the North Ridge. Don't wait supper." He left her standing there, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She touched her own face where his thumb had been. For the first time in 26 years, she didn't feel too big. She felt capable. January brought a silence to the mountains that was so deep it felt like the earth was holding its breath. The snow piled 5 feet high against the cabin walls. Elspeth had stopped wearing her corset weeks ago. It restricted her movement, and there was no one here to judge her waistline. She wore Elias's old flannel shirts and a skirt she had hemmed up to her ankles. She had also started reading the books. One afternoon, while Elias was out, she opened a leather folio on his desk. Inside were blueprints, detailed, complex architectural drawings of bridges. At the bottom of one, dated 1868, was the signature, Elias Thorne, Chief Engineer, Union Pacific. She stared at the paper. He wasn't just a trapper. He was a man of intellect, a man who had built the iron arteries of the nation. Why was he hiding in a hole in Montana? The answer came with blood. It was late afternoon when the storm rolled in. It wasn't a gradual graying of the sky. It was a sudden, violent assault of wind that shook the cabin timbers. Elias had been gone since dawn, tracking a cougar that had been prowling near the barn. By dusk, the wind was howling like a banshee. Visibility was zero. Elspeth paced the floor. Elias knew the woods, but no man could navigate a whiteout blizzard like this. 6 o'clock came, then 7. Elspeth grabbed the lantern and her heavy cloak. She took the rifle from the rack, a Winchester she had practiced with only twice. She didn't wait. She opened the door and plunged into the white hell. "Elias!" she screamed, the wind tearing the sound from her throat. She followed the faint depression of the trail toward the north ridge. The snow was waist-deep in drifts. A smaller woman would have been buried. Elspeth plowed through it, using her long legs to churn through the powder. Half a mile from the cabin, near the edge of a steep ravine known as the Devil's Drop, she heard it. Not a human voice, but the frantic whinny of a horse. She pushed forward. Through the swirling snow, she saw the black shape of Elias's horse, tangled in brush, rearing in panic. And on the ground, half buried in snow, was Elias. He wasn't moving. Elspeth scrambled down the slope, sliding on ice. "Elias!" he groaned. His leg was twisted at a sickening angle beneath a fallen pine branch that must have snapped in the wind. The heavy wood pinned him to the frozen earth. The snow around him was stained dark red. "Elspeth!" he rasped, his teeth chattering violently. "Go back. Too heavy." "Shut up," she snapped. She dropped the rifle and fell to her knees. She grabbed the pine branch. It was thick, waterlogged, and immensely heavy. "I'm going to lift it. You pull your leg out." "You can't," he whispered. His eyes were glazing over. Hypothermia was setting in. Elspeth planted her boots in the snow. She gripped the rough bark. She thought of her father's sneer. She thought of the years of being told she took up too much space. Use the space now, she told herself. Use the size. She roared, a primal sound of effort, and drove her legs upward. Her back strained. The muscles in her arms burned like fire. The log shifted. It lifted an inch, then 3. "Move!" she screamed. Elias, galvanized by her shout, dragged his broken body backward. Elspeth dropped the log. It crashed down, missing him by inches. She collapsed for a second, gasping, black spots dancing in her vision. But there was no time. "We have to move," she said. "Can't walk," Elias gritted out. "Legs broke." "I know." She looked at the horse. The animal was spooked and had bolted deeper into the trees. They were alone. Elspeth bent down. "Grab my shoulders." "Elspeth, no. I weigh 240 pounds. "And I am Elspeth Vance," she said fiercely. "I have carried the weight of my family's disappointment my entire life. You are light by comparison." She hauled him up. It was awkward and agonizing. She got her shoulder under his armpit, taking nearly all his weight. They began the trudge back. It took 2 hours to cover half a mile. Every step was a battle. Elspeth slipped, fell, and dragged him up again. Her boots were filled with snow. Her face was numb. Elias was drifting in and out of consciousness, muttering names she didn't know. Morgan, Bridges, collusion. When they finally crashed through the cabin door, Elspeth didn't have the strength to bring him to the bed. She dragged him to the rug in front of the fire. She stripped off his frozen clothes with shaking hands. The break in his leg was bad. The tibia had snapped, but the skin wasn't broken. The blood was from a gash on his head. She worked through the night. She set the bone, using the strength of her hands to pull the limb straight, while Elias screamed into a leather belt she forced between his teeth. She splinted it with kindling wood. She stitched the wound on his head. By morning, the storm had broken. The fire was low embers. Elspeth sat on the floor, leaning against the sofa, exhausted to her core. Elias opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling beams, then turned his head painfully to look at her. He saw her torn dress, her bruised hands, the exhaustion etched into her sharp, scarred face. "You carried me," he croaked. His voice was weak. "I did," she whispered. "Why?" "Because I am your wife, Elias Thorne." Elias looked at her for a long time. The barriers he had put up, the gruffness, the distance, crumbled. "I was an engineer," he said suddenly. "In Chicago. I built the Harrow Bridge. It collapsed. 12 men died." Elspeth straightened up. "I saw the drawings." "It wasn't my design," he said, the bitterness leaking out like poison. "The investors, a man named Cornelius Hatcher. He swapped the steel for cheap iron to save money. When it fell, they blamed me. They destroyed my name. I fled before the trial. I came here to die, Elspeth. I sent for a wife because I needed someone to bury me when the winter finally won." He reached out and took her hand. His grip was weak, but desperate. "Your father sent you as a joke," Elias said, his eyes watering. "But God sent you as a salvation. No delicate thing could have pulled that log. No beauty queen could have carried me up that hill." He brought her bruised knuckles to his lips and kissed them. "You are everything," he whispered. "You are the iron." Elspeth felt tears prick her eyes, hot and fast. For the first time, the scar on her face, the height of her body, the width of her shoulders. It didn't feel like a curse. It felt like armor. But peace in the mountains is fragile. Just as Elspeth leaned down to brush the hair from his fevered forehead, a sound cut through the morning silence. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a wolf. It was the distinct, metallic click of a lever-action rifle being cocked just outside the door. A voice, slick and unfamiliar, called out from the snow. "Elias, we know you're in there, and we know about the girl. Open up, or we burn you out." Elspeth looked at Elias. His face went pale, not from pain, but from recognition. "Hatcher," he hissed. "He found me." Cornelius Hatcher was a man who wore suits made of imported Italian wool, even in the wilderness. He stood just beyond the range of the cabin's windows, flanked by 3 men who looked like they would cut a throat for $1 and do it twice for free. Inside the cabin, the air had turned electric. Elspeth dropped to the floor, crawling toward the gun rack, keeping her head below the windowsill. "How many?" Elias whispered. He was trying to drag himself toward the wall, his face gray with pain. The splint on his leg knocked against the floorboards, a hollow sound in the tense silence. 4, maybe 5, Elspeth hissed. She grabbed the ammunition box and slid it across the floor to him. 1 in a suit, the rest are hired guns. "Hatcher?" Elias spat the name like a curse. He doesn't do his own dirty work. He's a coward with a checkbook. Outside, Hatcher's voice drifted through the cracks in the logs, smooth and terrifyingly calm. "Elias, be reasonable," Hatcher called out. "I don't want a scene. I just want the ledger. You took the company books when you ran. Hand them over, and we ride away. You can keep your little homestead." Elias looked at Elspeth. "The books," he whispered. "They prove he ordered the substitution of the iron. They prove he murdered those 12 men on the bridge." "Where are they?" Elspeth asked. "Buried under the floorboards of the smokehouse," Elias said. "If he gets them, he burns the evidence. If he doesn't get them, he burns us." Elspeth checked the load on the Winchester. It was heavy in her hands, cold steel against her sweating palms. She had never fired a gun at a man. She had barely fired at a deer. But as she looked at Elias, broken, feverish, and terrified not for himself, but for her, something in her chest hardened. "Mrs. Thorne," Hatcher's voice came again, dripping with mock politeness. "Or should I say, Miss Vance? Oh yes, I know all about you. Your father, Archibald, was quite talkative over a game of cards in St. Louis last month. He told the whole table how he pawned off his gargantuan daughter on a mountain hermit." Elspeth flinched. The sting of it was worse than a bullet. "He said he pitied the man who had to wake up next to you," Hatcher continued, laughing softly. "Come out, Elspeth. You don't owe this man anything. He's a fugitive. Walk out here, and I'll pay your fare back east. You can go be a governess, or a circus act, whatever suits you." Elspeth looked at Elias. He was watching her, his eyes full of fear. Not that she would die, but that she would believe Hatcher, that she would leave. Elspeth stood up, not fully, but enough to brace the rifle against the window frame. She smashed the glass with the barrel. "My name!" she shouted, her voice booming across the snow-covered clearing, "is Elspeth Thorne, and you are trespassing on my land." She didn't wait for a reply. She sighted the man standing to Hatcher's left, a scruffy gunman reaching for a whiskey flask, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard into her shoulder, leaving a bruise that would last for weeks. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. Outside, the gunman spun around, clutching his shoulder, and fell into the snow screaming. "Kill them!" Hatcher shrieked, his composure vanishing instantly. He dove behind a large boulder. The world exploded. Bullets shredded the wood of the cabin. Glass shattered inward, raining shards over the rug where Elias lay. Elspeth threw herself flat, covering her head as wood chips flew like shrapnel. "Stay low," Elias roared. He had managed to pull his heavy revolver from his holster. He propped himself up against the stone hearth. "Watch the door. They'll try to rush it." The siege lasted for hours. It was a game of patience and terror. Every time a head popped up from behind a tree, Elspeth or Elias fired. Elspeth's shoulder ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm. Her ears rang constantly. She wasn't a marksman, but she was steady. She didn't panic. While the men outside shouted and wasted ammunition spraying the cabin, Elspeth waited for clear shots. She was preserving bullets. She was calculating. Around noon, the shooting stopped. "They're regrouping," Elias said, wiping blood from his forehead. "They realized we aren't easy pickings. Hatcher didn't expect a fight. He expected a cripple and a spinster." "We can't hold them forever," Elspeth said, crawling to his side with a canteen of water. "We have 20 rounds left, and they have the perimeter." "We don't need to hold them forever," Elias said. He looked at the fireplace, then at the large rug in the center of the room. We just need to wait for dark." "What happens at dark?" "At dark," Elias said grimly, "they stop shooting and start burning. Hatcher won't wait another day. He'll torch the cabin to flush us out." "Then we die," Elspeth said, her voice flat. "No." Elias grabbed her hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. "We don't die. I didn't spend 3 years building this place just to be trapped in it. Elspeth, move the rug." Elspeth frowned, but did as he asked. She pulled back the heavy bearskin rug. Beneath it, the floorboards looked normal. "The knothole," Elias pointed. "Pry it up." She dug her fingernails into the wood and pulled. A section of the floor came loose. Beneath it wasn't dirt. It was darkness. A shaft. "The cabin sits on top of an old prospector's vent," Elias explained. "It connects to the silver mine tunnels that run through the ridge. It comes out a mile east near the river." Elspeth looked at the dark hole, then at Elias's broken leg. "You can't climb down a ladder, Elias, and I can't carry you down a vertical shaft." "I have a pulley system rigged," he said. "Block and tackle hooked to the ceiling beam. I built it just in case I ever had to move heavy ore, or a body." Elspeth looked at him, realizing the depth of this man's paranoia and his brilliance. He had been planning for this war long before she arrived. "We wait for dusk," Elias commanded. "When the sun drops, they'll move in with torches. That's when we drop into the hole." "And the ledger?" Elspeth asked. "The evidence?" Elias closed his eyes. "It's in the smokehouse. We can't get to it. We have to leave it." "If we leave it, Hatcher wins," Elspeth said. "He burns the cabin. He burns the smokehouse. The proof is gone. You'll be a fugitive forever. We will be hunted forever." Elias looked at her, agony in his eyes. "I choose you over the book, Elspeth. I choose your life. Let it burn." Elspeth didn't answer. She looked at the window. The sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long purple shadows across the snow. The wolves were at the door, and the fire was coming. Dusk arrived, with the smell of kerosene. Elspeth could hear them moving closer. The crunch of boots on snow was louder now. Hatcher was getting bold. "Last chance, Thorn," Hatcher yelled. "Come out or cook." Inside, Elspeth had rigged the pulley. She wrapped the rope around Elias's chest, under his arms. He groaned as the rope tightened against his bruised ribs. "Go," Elias whispered. "Lower me down, then follow." "I'll be right behind you," Elspeth lied. She lowered him into the darkness. It was a slow, grueling process. His weight strained the rope, and the pulley creaked ominously. Elspeth braced her feet against the hearth, her muscles trembling. When the tension finally went slack, she knew he was at the bottom. "Elspeth!" His voice echoed up from the shaft. "Come down!" Elspeth tied the rope off. Then she grabbed the Winchester. She didn't go to the hole. She went to the back door. "Elspeth!" Elias screamed from the darkness. "What are you doing?" "I'm not letting him win, Elias," she whispered to herself. She kicked the back door open. The sudden noise drew the attention of the gunman at the front. She sprinted, not toward the woods, but toward the smokehouse. It was 50 feet of open ground. "There she is!" someone shouted. A bullet whizzed past her ear, snapping like a whip. Another kicked up snow at her feet. Elspeth didn't stop. She ran with the long, loping strides of a woman who had spent her life wishing she was smaller, now grateful for every inch of her stride. She slammed into the smokehouse door, bursting inside. It smelled of cured ham and sawdust. She fell to her knees, frantically tearing at the loose dirt in the corner Elias had described. Her fingers brushed metal. A strongbox. Outside, the cabin erupted. A torch had been thrown. The dry pine logs, soaked in years of resin, caught instantly. The orange glow illuminated the yard like a stage. Elspeth grabbed the strongbox. It was heavy, steel reinforced. She tucked it under her arm. "She's in the shed," a gunman yelled. Elspeth looked around. There was no back exit. She was trapped. The only way out was the way she came in, and 3 men were standing there with rifles. She looked up. The smokehouse had a ventilation slat in the roof, high up, too high for a normal person to reach. Elspeth Vance stood on top of the curing table. She reached up. Her height, the curse that had made her a pariah in St. Louis, allowed her fingers to grasp the edge of the roof vent. She hauled herself up, the muscles in her back screaming. She kicked the slats out and squeezed through the opening onto the roof, just as the door below was kicked in. "She's gone," the gunman confusedly shouted from inside the shed. Elspeth lay flat on the roof of the smokehouse. The heat from the burning cabin was intense. The main house was a towering inferno now. The roof was collapsing. She saw Hatcher standing by the burning front door, smiling. He thought they were inside. He thought he had won. Elspeth slid down the backside of the smokehouse roof and dropped into the deep snowdrift behind it. She clutched the strongbox to her chest and crawled. She crawled until her hands were numb, circling wide around the clearing, moving toward the river where the mine tunnel exited. She found the tunnel mouth an hour later. It was hidden behind a thicket of frozen blackberry bushes. "Elias," she called into the blackness. "Elspeth." His voice was broken, filled with a despair she had never heard. "Oh, God, I thought you were inside. I heard the roof fall." She scrambled into the tunnel, dragging the strongbox. She found him sitting in the dirt, his head in his hands, weeping. He thought she had sacrificed herself to distract them. Elspeth dropped the heavy steel box at his feet. It landed with a dull thud. Elias looked up. He touched the box. Then he looked at her, soot-stained, bleeding from a scratch on her cheek, her dress torn, looming over him in the dark. "You went back," he whispered. "I went back," she said, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "You could have died for a book." "Not for a book," Elspeth said fiercely. "For our life. If we have this, we don't have to run. If we have this, we can fight him." Elias reached up and pulled her down to him. He buried his face in her neck, sobbing with relief and shock. "You crazy, stubborn woman." "I am a Vance," she said, holding him tight. "We are hard to kill." They stayed in the tunnel for the night, huddled together for warmth. Outside, Hatcher and his men watched the cabin burn to the ground. They poked through the ashes in the morning, found nothing but twisted metal and bone remnants from the pantry, which they assumed were the occupants. Satisfied that the loose ends were tied up, Hatcher and his men rode out at noon. When the coast was clear, Elspeth helped Elias to the tunnel exit. They looked out at the valley. The cabin was gone. The smokehouse was scorched. "We have nothing," Elias said quietly. "No home, no food. My leg is useless." Elspeth stood up and looked at the smoking ruins. She didn't see an end. She saw a beginning. She reached down and picked up the strongbox. "We have the evidence," she said, "and we have a head start. They think we're dead, Elias. That makes us ghosts." She turned to him, her eyes hard and cold as the mountain winter. "And ghosts are very good at haunting." "What do we do?" Elias asked, looking at her not as a protector, but as a leader. "We go to Bannock," Elspeth said. We find a judge who isn't in Hatcher's pocket. But first, she looked at the Winchester rifle she had managed to keep strapped to her back. First, we hunt. We need meat. And then we hunt Hatcher. Elias smiled, a grim, dangerous expression that matched hers. I know a judge in Bannock, an old friend, but getting there, it's 50 miles through snow. I walked up this mountain in a dress, Elspeth said, helping him stand on his good leg. I can walk down it with a vengeance. They turned their backs on the ruins of their joke of a marriage and walked into the timberline, a partnership forged in fire and sealed in iron. The trek to Bannock was a 6-day march through purgatory. Elspeth and Elias moved through a landscape determined to finish what Hatcher had started. Elias's leg was agony, every step a battle against gravity, but he leaned heavily on a crude crutch Elspeth had fashioned, refusing to stop. They slept in snow caves, huddled together for warmth, with the heavy steel strongbox serving as a cold, hard pillow. You're stronger than the bridge I built, Elias murmured one night, watching Elspeth break stream ice with her bare hands. The steel snapped. You don't. Steel doesn't have spite to keep it warm, Elspeth replied, her lips cracked from the cold. I do. They arrived in Bannock on a Sunday, looking like beggars. A giantess in a torn dress and a crippled man with a beard matted in ice. They didn't go to a doctor. They went straight to the courthouse. Judge Tobias Clay nearly fell out of his chair when they entered his chambers. Elias, Hatcher said you burned. He said you were both dead. We crawled out, Elspeth said, stepping forward. She slammed the steel strongbox onto the mahogany desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot. But my father is here, isn't he? The judge nodded grimly. He arrived yesterday. He's at the Golden Garter Saloon right now, meeting with Hatcher. Since you died intestate, Archibald claimed your land as next of kin. He's signing the timber deeds over to Hatcher within the hour. A cold, terrifying smile spread across Elspeth's face. He came to sell my bones before they were even cold. I can issue a warrant, Clay offered. No, Elias said, looking at the fire in his wife's eyes. We need witnesses. We need the whole town to see it. The Golden Garter was packed with miners and smoke. At the best table, Cornelius Hatcher and Archibald Vance sat with a bottle of expensive champagne. Archibald looked nervous but greedy, signing the deed with a shaking hand. To tragic accidents, Hatcher smirked, raising his glass. Yes, tragic, Archibald muttered. But Elspeth, she was a burden, Mr. Hatcher. A large, silent expense. I sent her here, thinking the hardship might well resolve the issue. At least now she has provided value to the estate. The saloon doors swung open. The wind that blew in was arctic, extinguishing the lamps near the entrance. The piano player stopped. The silence was heavy. Elspeth Vance stood framed in the doorway. She wore a coat of raw wolf fur Elias had draped over her, making her look even broader, wilder. She held the Winchester rifle in the crook of her arm. Behind her, leaning on his crutch, was Elias Thorne. Archibald dropped his glass. It shattered. Elspeth, you're dead? I am hard to kill, Father. Elspeth's voice boomed through the hall. You should know. You tried hard enough. She walked toward the table, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea. She stopped in front of her father, who shrank back in terror. She picked up the signed deed, crushed it in her scarred, powerful hand, and dropped it into a spittoon. You sent me here as a joke, she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. You showed this man a picture of Lavinia because you were ashamed of me. You thought the mountain would break me. You thought I would die, and you would be free of the ugly daughter. She leaned down, her face inches from his. But you didn't send me to my death, Father. You sent me to my kingdom. Archibald scrambled out of his chair, terrified by the iron in her eyes. He didn't look back. He ran for the door, fleeing the daughter he had underestimated for 26 years. Hatcher stood up, his hand reaching inside his coat for a derringer. Click. Elspeth leveled the Winchester at his chest before he could even draw. Give me a reason, she said. Please. Judge Clay stepped forward with 2 marshals. Mr. Hatcher, we have a ledger to discuss, and 12 counts of negligent homicide regarding the Harrow Bridge. Elias provided the proof this morning. Hatcher looked at Elias, stunned. You kept it all these years? I was waiting for the right partner to help me carry it, Elias said, looking at Elspeth with adoration. As the marshals dragged Hatcher away, the miners cheered. But Elspeth didn't hear them. She dropped the rifle and sank to the floor, her legs finally giving way. Elias caught her, pulling her against his chest. It's over, he whispered. It's done. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it arrived, it was vibrant. Elias and Elspeth didn't rebuild the cabin. They built a home higher up near the waterfall, with large windows to let in the light. Elias used the reward money and the railroad settlement to start Thorne and Vance Engineering. Their first project wasn't for a train, but a bridge across the gorge near their home, a beautiful arch of steel and stone. Elspeth never went back to society. She ran the timber operation, earning the nickname the Iron Queen. One evening, a year later, she stood on their bridge. Elias walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Your sister wrote, he said. She wants to visit. Elspeth laughed, a rich sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Tell her she's welcome, but tell her there are no carriages here. She'll have to walk. I don't think she'll come, Elias said, kissing the scar on her jaw. She's not built for the altitude. No, Elspeth agreed, leaning back into him. She isn't. The joke had been on Archibald. He had thrown away what he thought was coal, never realizing that under the pressure of the mountain, coal turns into diamond. Elspeth wasn't the ugly daughter. She was the mountain itself, wild, enduring, and breathtakingly beautiful to the only man who dared to climb her heights. And that is the story of Elspeth Vance and Elias Thorne. It's a reminder that sometimes the things the world tells us are our weaknesses, our scars, our size, our refusal to fit into a mold, are actually our greatest strengths, waiting for the right environment to flourish. Archibald Vance wanted to punish his daughter by sending her to the wild, but instead, he set her free. If you enjoyed this story of frontier justice and unconventional love, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want to hear more stories about the wild history of the West, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video. What did you think of Elspeth's revenge? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.